And we're live.
Dobrý den, já vás zdravím z našeho jihlavského.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Hello from Ji.hlava, from the Inspiration Forum studio in Ji.hlava. This is our day 4, and I'm happy to welcome you to the Cool Africa program. A few organizational comments. From the first, you can follow us on the Inspiration Forum Facebook, on our YouTube channels, and if you want to ask questions from our guests, please do so in the comments section. And now, Andrea Filipi, politologist joining us from Belgium, will introduce our guests both in the studio and online. Good evening. Hello and welcome to our panel discussion as part of the International Documentary Film Festival in Ji.hlava and its Inspiration Forum. Welcome to the panel discussion on Cool Africa, focusing on climate change. Hello from Belgium. The situation here is no better than in the Czech Republic in terms of COVID. Like many of us, I am joining you from my home, and my 3-year-old daughter is with me, and she is not very cooperative. So in case there's any disturbance and my daughter wants to participate, please do excuse me. So, welcome to the third panel discussion as part of the Cool Africa cycle. We are talking about climate change in Africa. Yesterday, we were talking about the relationship between the Czech Republic and Africa, what are the connections, and what is Czech Republic's foreign policy towards Africa. We also had a discussion focusing on migration issues. Today we are going to talk about agriculture more and food security in the context of climate change. And I'm very happy that we have on our panel 3 guests whom I'm going to introduce. We have Ndoni Mcunu, who is shortly going to give her keynote speech from South Africa. Ndoni is doing her PhD at the Witwatersrand University, one of the foremost universities in South Africa and in Africa in general. Her doctoral thesis is in environmental science. She is also an activist with issues like access to education, trying to improve access to education for everyone, and especially for women. For this purpose, she has founded Black Women in Science organization. The aims of this organization is to have more women scientists and researchers. And as I said, Ndoni is going to have the keynote presentation very shortly. Our next guest is Barbora Šedová. She is in Berlin, where she co-heads the Future Lab at the University of Potsdam. Future Lab is focusing on ethnic conflicts, migration, and security, particularly in the developing world. She is also a doctoral student at the Potsdam University, and her field is economy, if I'm not mistaken.
neposlední řadě se také našeho panelu zúčastí Dr. Alexander Ač, který...
And we also have with us Dr. Alexander Ač, who is in Ji.hlava in the studio. He is a researcher at the Global Change Research Institute of the Czech Academy of Sciences. He is an environmentalist specializing on the isotope analysis of tree rings and soil carbon emissions inventory. He studied environmental ecology at the Šafařík University in Slovakia, and he has a PhD in applied ecology. And I think that's all from me for introductions. And now, Ndoni, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. I hope everybody can hear me. It is an absolute pleasure to be here today. And I am angry at COVID because now I can't be at the Czech Republic. I can't meet my amazing panelists, and I'm at home. So I'm actually quite sad, but also very happy that I've got such an amazing platform and an international platform to have my voice as an African. So I'm going to try to stick to the 15 minutes in as much as I can. So I'm going to get my timer out. So today I'm part of this amazing panel called Cool Africa. And I loved the word because if it was a science forum, it would be written all the stats word, you know, I don't know, climate change in Africa. But Cool Africa is just exactly where we want to go. Even if we speak climate change wise in Africa, it is said that our continent will actually become warmer. Right now, we are even facing heat waves. So it would be nice to have a cool Africa in the future. And the whole point of this today is to talk about climate change, to talk about Africa, and to talk about international media. I thought I should add that in relation to this amazing festival, which is the International Film Festival. So who am I? I'm Ndoni Mcunu, and the first part of me is that I'm the founder of an organization called Black Women in Science. And here we try to focus on empowering young women, especially those that are in their postgraduate qualification, to pursue the sciences, to get into professorship, to get into their PhDs. And that's what we try to motivate them in because of the stats around Black academics in Africa. So this is a part of my organization. I don't want to dwell into this. It's just the side of me that has fed a lot into how I then started to think about where do I stand in a global perspective with issues of climate change, with issues of women, with issues of research and academia. It all started from me recognizing the lack of representation within my field of climate change and then feeding into all these other fields in academia and research. And here we work with over 250 Black women, and we motivate them to take a career in science, or rather, we motivate them to stay in the sciences. And so then there's another part of me, and the other part of me is that I'm a PhD candidate, unfortunately still a candidate, at the University of Witwatersrand University in Johannesburg in South Africa. And here my PhD really focuses on climate change, resilience, and food production. So my study area really is focused on how do we make farmers more resilient to the impacts of climate change. And there are basic concepts here that we try to focus on. So the study area here, and I wanted us to start here with the story of small-scale farmers. So my study area is Zambia, and this is all from my data that we collected across Zambia. So we're looking at over 150 farmers. And if you can see here, the yellow is the spread of small-scale farming. So if we look into food production, climate change in Africa, we need to know that the narrative of Africa, when we speak about agriculture, is small-scale farming. And how much support do these small-scale farmers actually have? So this is the story of small-scale farming. This was actually a site visit in Africa. The middle picture here, it shows you how most of the food production in Africa in climate change for small scale farmers is to sell their food off of supermarkets in their local communities at a very small hectare, between 0.5 to 2 hectares. And this is how our small scale farmers make their food, meaning that this is the majority of how food systems work in Africa. So on your left and on your right, it was our site visits with our international team from Brazil, China, and the USA that came to South Africa to try understand these food systems in Africa and relate it in the relation of climate change and international food production. And so what is the point of us all meeting together? So we are trying to see the effects of scale. So when we talk about scale, we're talking about the actual size of the farm, and crop diversity. We mean, how can we know that small scale farmers are known to plant many crops rather than crop diversity? Here we can see that they're planting many different crops. So it's looking at small scale. It doesn't matter about what scale it is. Crop diversity just looks at your plot of land, how many different crops are you planting? And we're trying to see what is the role of scale. So if you're a small scale farmer, and if you're a large scale farmer, if you are planting one crop versus many crop, how resilient are you to food production and the changing of climate? And this concept is known as ecological security, which I'll build on more later. So that picture really looks into this landscape, and this is the African landscape. You can see that some areas have trees, some have plain land, some have grass, some have agriculture, large scale, and we're just trying to understand the African landscape. And so why I want to understand this is because we're trying to dig deeper into the concept of ecological security. So the theory is that large scale farmers plant one big crop. So if you are planting just maize and then a flood comes in, what are the chances that the resilience of maize is the same for that kind of crop species? Once a flood comes in, you are completely wiped out. So your crop diversity and your ecological security is known to decrease. But if we look into small scale farmers and they are planting at a smaller scale with many different crops, their ecological security, the hypothesis is that they will have higher security to the changes of climate change, meaning that if you have spinach in one part of land, as well as carrots, as well as spinach, as well as sugarcane, or whatever the case may be, different crops are resilient to these kind of effects. So what's the point of this research? And I wanted to really get into it because diversification is known as one of the few viable strategies available to manage the climate risks. And this kind of method of diversification is not yet studied in Africa and known to be done as a method by small scale farmers in Africa. It's something that we've been doing, but we just haven't written it down in terms of the science of it and really invested our knowledge and our efforts into this. And this is important in the whole narrative of international media and research and food production. Then we go into that small scale farmers and large scale farmers. As I showed you in the beginning, that the majority of the population are small scale farmers, but majority of them want to aspire to be large scale farmers. And the assumption is that the larger you go, the more food you have, the bigger land, the more resilient you are. But this theory is telling you that having many crops may actually be more ecologically secure for you as a farmer. But now, how do we manage these dynamics in terms of climate change and the need for small scale farmers wanting to become bigger? And then the honest discussion of yields and scaling up. So going back into that, some of my research has found that small scale farmers' yields is actually not that much different to large scale farming. And that may come to the conversation of them having many crops, them being diversified, but then why are we so stuck on these small scale farmers wanting to go large scale? And could this, and this goes into my next point, in that could this be a poverty trap in them wanting to go large scale, given the need of the technology, of the skills, of the scale that you need to get into that large scale? Do we have that access for our small scale farmers? So could we actually be frustrating them and putting them back into the cycle of poverty? And that's the conversation we need to have. Indigenous knowledge systems. So when you look into
Dalším bodem je vlastně, jsou ty domorodé znalosti toho, co ti to tradiční zemědělství umí.
It is actually a method that we can use in understanding diversification in indigenous knowledge systems.
Právě to tradiční farmářství je něco, co...
And then when we look into farmers, we can look into how farmers have undertaken different strategies in coping with this kind of impacts of climate change. And so I want to move on to, after we find these findings, and we find that that diversification is an African method that we are using to adapt to climate change without technology, just using it as our indigenous systems. After the findings, what happens? And I think this is where the Inspiration Forum comes in. And I want to link the importance of these findings as an African scientist, as Africa, into international platforms as to who tells the story and who then misinterprets the story. And I have case studies for this. So, sorry, I want to go back. When we look into this, the question that I ask myself, so when we search online, research science, climate change, food production, what are the images that we see? And that is what I want us to look into. So even when we're looking into climate change in Africa, even when you search diversification, adaptation, and mitigation of climate change in Africa, ask yourself, where is the African element? And that should actually make you understand the representation issues we have when it comes to findings in this kind of topic. And so here I wanted to go into a personal case study. I did a press release with Greta Thunberg, who's a climate activist internationally, to talk about the removal of the image of Vanessa, who's an African activist at the World Economic Forum in one of the images in Switzerland. And one of the things that I said was that Africa can adapt. And this is when I was speaking about diversification as a method that we've been using without necessarily us being recorded as the founders of this method. And I said Africa can adapt. And one of the papers, which is the Valued Daily News, said that that Africa cannot. So the changing of the narrative in international media, and there was another newspaper which quoted me right, and this was a local paper, Sunday Times, that said that Africa can. And this might be something small, but it's not something small. Because I could say that diversification is a way of us adapting, but then if someone changes it and says it's not in international news, it changes the narrative. And so a second case study was that it was a big headline. When we look into BBC Africa, it was Greta Thunberg seeks African climate change action. But it actually was the other way around. Why was it that African climate change activists are noticed and have their names, but it was almost like we are being drawn in by Greta Thunberg, which is great, but the challenge here was African climate activism. And so this is a challenge that we have when we talk about climate change in Africa, in our continent. So again, Greta Thunberg seeks African climate change. And for international media, this is where it becomes challenging. And then another article that I had with Nature, which is an international scientific journal, which is leading. The topic here, you can see disadvantaged background. And my message is talking about unifying voices. So what is the image that we want to show around food production and Africa in our continent? So who's telling our story? If we look into African-led climate activism, are international media actually listening with the intention to understand, to grow, and to change the image of Africa? Or are they looking for an actual headline? And I think this is where we need to get into the conversation around food production and climate change in Africa. And are we aware of the experts? Who are the leading experts? When you look into the indigenous knowledge system in the beginning of my presentation, this looks into the climate modeling. So when we look into the data that we have to feed into our weather systems and the technology and the drones, who are the leading experts bringing in this technology in our continent? And who are the leading experts training our people to know this kind of technology? So I'm advocating for in international media, a new concept that came up, which is intersectional environmentalism. And this looks at climate change and food production in Africa from an African perspective out. So simple things like if we talk about food production, if I talk about diversification, if I talk about technology to an African community, how do you interpret it in their language? And this is the problem. So before we even start talking about the planet, climate change, and food production, we should really understand our communities and the uniqueness of it. And so I'm hoping that maybe we can, speak more into intersectional environmentalism as a concept and what it means for Africa. Thank you so much.
Děkuji moc krát, Ndoni, za toto úvodní slovo.
Thank you, Ndoni, for your keynote address. And at this point, I'd very much like our two other panelists to share their response with Ndoni's presentation and also present your research, because both Barbora and Alexander are academics and they do their own research. So we would like to know how their field relates to the present topic. So perhaps first Barbora Šedová. Thank you. Good evening. I'm very happy for the invitation and to the discussion we're going to have.
Moje jméno je Barbora Šedová a ještě bych ráda opravila moju affiliation, teda správně jako Andrea.
My name is Barbora Šedová and I'm finishing my doctoral studies at Potsdam University. And I also work at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Change Research. I'm a researcher there. So basically what I do is research of the impact of global change focusing on the global south. And similar to Ndoni, I'm looking at possible adaptation strategies, but perhaps from a different angle, because I don't do field research or case studies. I look at what we can read from data, and one of the projects I'm working on is the impact on migration and security and wars in sub-Saharan Africa as a result of climate change. On the one hand, global warming causes migration, primarily from rural to urban areas. And thus climate change enhances urbanization. And we are also finding that migration is a high-cost phenomenon, not only economic cost. And not everyone whose livelihood suffers from worsening conditions, not everybody can actually afford to migrate. So the most vulnerable segments of populations are actually trapped in the impacted areas. And that obviously negatively impacts your ability to adapt to climate change. That's something that is often not mentioned in connection with migration. The danger of being trapped in these conditions really the most vulnerable are precisely small-scale farmers, children, and the elderly. Climate change enhances, obviously, migration, as I said, from the countryside to the cities, and the cities often don't have sufficient infrastructure and capacity to absorb the migrants because of the job market or accommodation. It simply isn't big enough. And this can obviously also lead to escalating tension, escalating conflicts, and it enhances international migration. Thus, climate change can create migration cascades. Our research also shows that not only local but also global climate impacts, such as the rise in food prices, also are additional stress factors influencing migration. Migration from the global south. So that's an introduction to my research.
Děkuji moc, Barboře, děkuji. Jestli můžu předat slovo Alexandrovi, aby také nám jinak krátce reagoval asi na ten...
Alexander, if you can respond to Ndoni's presentation and introduce your research and how it relates to the subject of our panel today.
Dobrý večer přeji, také děkuji za pozvání na dnešní
Good evening.
fórum. A jmenuji se teda Alexander Ach.
My name is Alexander Ach. I work at the Global Change Research Institute of the Academy of Sciences, and we try to apply a broad perspective on global climate change. We're looking at it on the impact both on natural ecosystems and on ecosystems that are man-made. So we're looking at social issues too. Some of the last projects we've been involved in, we are doing isotope analysis of tree rings, looking at carbon content, which gives us basically the current climate change into the context of past centuries and millennia, because we can show how dramatic or how exceptional the current change is if we compare it to the changes in the past centuries. There are many studies of this kind, perhaps hundreds, but we are focusing on Central Europe, so we're adding one region to the global picture.
Ale v zásadě také dlouhodobě se z toho mýho pohledu se snažím.
And also I have been trying to follow the impact of climate change globally.
Není to primárně jako práce na ústavu, ale
and this is not something I do at the Academy of Science, but I also pursue the communication of climate change to the general public, sometimes successfully, sometimes less so. Some years ago, I wrote a chapter for a book on the impact of climate change in the developing world, including Africa. And so I was very impressed with the presentation we just heard, because as Europeans or citizens of the Western world, we think we understand things because we've read a paper, but that doesn't make us experts on that field. So I am very happy to be able to hear a presentation from somebody who is working, who is giving us the perspective from Africa, and to show us that the knowledge and know-how of the local people is essential. In fact, this goes not only for Africa, but for South America, Asia, for everywhere.
Myslím si, že stále vlastně ty možnosti západních univerzit, neříkám třeba, že
yet at the same time, the possibilities of Western universities also have something to offer, maybe in terms of prognosis, in terms of modeling impact. So I think there should be a greater exchange of know-how and of knowledge, and I think it will be critical for making some progress in adaptation and trying to mitigate the impact of climate change.
Děkuji moc Alexandrovi. Tak já tady mně se tady nabízí hned několik témat hrozně zajímavých, které jste tady otevřeli společně, ať už se jedná přesně o vlastně znalosti místního obyvatelstva a jeho důležitost. Ndoni ze svého výzkumu jasně ukázala, jak vlastně možná dochází k takové paradoxní situaci, kdy na jednu stranu to naše know-how...
Well, know-how is very important, so we have to come back to that indigenous knowledge, as Ndoni mentioned. That's really important, because what we know is not necessarily useful in terms of food production security and the adaptation on climate change. We open up an issue of migration caused by climate change, urbanization and its impacts, and also
kam tedy od tohoto bodu máme kráčet.
Question also is where to go from now. What shall we do on an international level? So I would like to hear from all of you.
Domnívám se, že to, co Ndoni tak trochu
what Ndoni has already mentioned, and I'm a political scientist, so we actually talk about decolonization of knowledge and access and perception of the world. So I would like to hear from all of you, what is your take on decolonization in the context of climatic change? What do we lack? What do we need to do today so that politicians and stakeholders do to help decolonization? In the context of today's discussion, Ndoni, if you start, please.
That's a great question, actually, because I think one thing I do not advocate for is removing the science of it. So I'm definitely someone who says the foundation of the science is there. It's now a matter of communication, and also how we integrate both worlds of the science with the local people. And what tends to happen in that integration is that the science becomes overpowering than the voices of the local people. So I think what needs to happen is obviously a flip around into us almost decolonizing our minds, decolonizing what we understand of Africa from the beginning internationally. There is this concept, and we joke here in South Africa that, when I go to Africa, when I was in the USA, it was, oh my gosh, do you see a lion walking on your yard? And it's like, I don't see a lion. Of course not, We have houses, we have facilities, we have infrastructure. And I think it's first of all, us as experts, decolonizing our minds, our pre-assumptions. And then when we move into our research, being so aware as to who are the local people that are here to actually proofread this. And it doesn't have to be necessarily a farmer. It can literally be a PhD student or a professor or whoever that is at your level of understanding your document, to read through all the facts that you've got going on in your page. And I think that's very important. So an example would be with Greenpeace International, I got to read the extreme weather events report, which is going to be launched, and I co-authored it. That's going to be launched soon, I think next week. And I came in, and that document was written in the UK because the science unit is there. But as I came in from Africa, there was immediately points that I could see were missing as a first read, because I was someone who wasn't from the same background. So I think we need to flip the script and say, yes, the science is there as a foundation, but let us all decolonize our minds and hear people's voices as experts and not say, oh, well, they're just a local. And try to see how do you make sure that in everything that you do, be it media, be it your research paper, who are the local people that have actually advised you in this kind of a concept?
Jestli můžu, Ndoni, ještě asi jednu takovou následující otázku.
I have a follow-up question to what you've just said.
Protože většina našich diváků,
Because most people who are watching us right now come from the Czech Republic. So it's a very different geographical context.
Tak třeba nějaký, jestli byste mohla třeba
So if you could give us an example about that Greenpeace report you've just read and you find controversial, what would you change perhaps in that report? If you could give us an example for Czech audience.
Sure, amazing, thanks. So I think what I would change is, so a section would have looked at the impacts of climate change in Africa and of not climate change, so we'll focus on specifically extreme weather events. And so it's easy to look at biodiversity. It's very easy to look at food production, you know, all these oceans, but it's not a common thing to look at the economics. So to link it into how does climate change influence the economics? So when we talk about climate activism in Africa, there is a gap around people feeling not linked to it. It's almost like a westernized problem. And so what we need to do there is bridge that gap. And to bridge that gap, we need to understand the economy of our continent and then understand where are people's mindsets when you talk about climate change. So if you come in and you say, I'm talking about climate change to you, this is what extreme weather events would do. There'll be heat waves, there'll be all of this. They're gonna first say to you, I need food, I need a job, I need a house, I need good healthcare. And you wanna talk to me about climate change. And this is a real conversation. So there needs to be now a conversation of the economics, the impacts of climate change or extreme weather events on the economical lifestyle of Africa. And we need to be very specific about it. So if it's going to create jobs, so if you say that a cyclone will disrupt a building and then there's a need to reconstruct these buildings and that's job creation, you need to put it like that in the sense of you need to link the leaders into what kind of jobs would it get? How will it get our people out of poverty? And we need to link those issues together. So it's easy to list biodiversity, heat waves, ocean temperature change, all these other things, but go deeper into the poverty and how do you always get people, how does climate change make a lifestyle for an African community better? How would that solve their problem? And I think that's where you would look at it from.
Děkuji moc krát. Můžu předat slovo Barboře.
Tak ja by som rada nadviazala v prvom rade na ten prvý koment, alebo teda prvú reakciu Ndoni. A ja si myslím, že to je extrémne dôležité v podstate ako keby spájať také tie perspektívy, ktoré sú viac z také ako keby makropohľadu a teda
I think it's important to connect the perspectives and bring in perhaps data analysis and field research.
V podstate ja si myslím, že ako keby tomuto ako keby spôsobu výskumu sa hovorí.
This type of research in my field is called the multi-method approach. And I think it's the most viable method of understanding a context, to look at the micro impact and that zoom in on the specific situations and understand the concrete implications on real life or the people living locally, on the local populations. That's obviously something that's very hard to read from data. And one of the things Ndoni has suggested, that if a researcher publishes a scientific paper, it would be great to have it proofread by people on the ground who are involved in the local context, to understand these things as specialists, but also understand the local context and the practical implications. I think that's a very important idea. All these policies that have been issued based on macro analysis, they are all very theoretical and often fail to meet the aim.
Skvěle, děkuji. Můžu předat slovo teď Alexandrovi, prosím.
Thank you. And now Alexander, if you can comment.
Z mého pohledu, pokud bych přímo komentoval ten pojem dekolonizace,
if I were to comment on decolonization, I think what it means is the opposite approach than to everything that went on before. Because colonization was followed by neocolonialism. So, and I think nothing has changed in the approach of many people. The situation perhaps has improved, and there is an effort to help in many spheres. But unfortunately, I think from the point of the people on the ground, nothing has changed. My personal experience of discussions, sometimes on social networks. Even experts on climate change have a very stereotypical view on why people migrate, who is it that's migrating, and what is the motivation. And I'm not talking only about the Syrian migration crisis, but migration also from other countries. And these researchers, they may have great education, but very often their opinion is dominated by prejudice. And the situation there is vast potential for improvement, because we had this major discussion in the Czech Republic if we can have 40 refugees from Syria, and it was a huge problem, and that's ridiculous. We're looking at climate change, and the problems we are going to face are going to be out of that scale. I've been looking at statistics about the volume of money globally going to research on climate change, and only 1.12% went to social sciences. That's quite shocking. I think that has to change. Because the natural sciences have already told us what to do: reduce emissions now, globally. And ideally, the richest countries should do the most. And we know this, and we essentially know what will happen if we don't do what we need to do. And we have a rough picture also of the adaptations. And also, in Africa, we have a rough idea of the situation on the ground. But the social sciences lag behind. And even experts have almost zero knowledge of the social context. And the awareness among the public, there really is, things really have to improve significantly. Thank you. I think I have a lot of notes for a 2-hour discussions from all of you. Yes, indeed, the perspective in the Czech Republic is especially very stereotypical and very limited. The way we look at the world and Africa in the context of migration. So perhaps that's a moment to give the floor to the town of Ji.hlava, because the festival organizers conducted a poll among Ji.hlava citizens. And the question was, what will be the impact of climate change in Africa? So the people of Ji.hlava are answering this question.
No, tak ty změny se tam určitě dějou už velký.
I guess they already feel this huge climatic change, and I guess it's going to be worse.
A bude se určitě měnit potom ten způsob života, který
And it will cause changes in their lifestyle, which is surely connected more to nature. Well, droughts, that's what first comes to mind. Deserts will get larger, there will be shortage of water, and that will cause migration. Well, there is a huge imbalance, and everything will start to move in nature, also migration, because a lot of people would lose jobs, and there will be shortage of food. Well, I'm not sure what climatic change going to do in the Czech Republic, let alone Africa. It can be very different. We might have warmer climate, warmer than Africa. Unless we do something, then it's going to be inhospitable everywhere. No one will be possible to live. So it's not just the problem of Africa, it's an issue for all of us. Well, we know what kind of problems we have. We have data, we have prognosis, but no one does anything about it. So future is not going to be bright. That doesn't go just for Africa, but for everywhere.
Tak já moc děkuju, to úplně
thank you very much. That leads me to my next question, because of course in the context of our panel we talk about Africa, and we know what people usually think about Africa. They believe that the situation is going to be worse. In the 90s, we used to associate Africa with wars, but nowadays in media, we see mostly climatic change and threat connected to it with migration. So we are afraid of migration from Africa sometimes, but is it really true that problems in Africa are unique in context of climatic change? Doesn't make sense to talk about climatic changes in Africa? Wouldn't it be better to talk about climate change in general? I would start with Barbara.
Ďakujem. Ja by som povedala, že problémy sú
Well, I believe that none of these issues are exclusive to Africa. We are talking about global problems. For global south, I believe that south is actually more affected by climate change, and they are not able to adapt to them so well. But when talking about climate change, it's really not possible to talk about us and them. And to talk about climate change in Africa, it actually doesn't make sense to talk about Africa as one unit, about Africa as a whole, because Africa is a huge continent. And depending on economic and institutional context and so on, then of course each African country faces different challenges regarding climate change. So it's all connected, but at the same time it's individual. And Ndoni, would you comment on it?
I think I definitely do agree with Barbora. I'm sorry if I said your name wrong, but I definitely do agree in the fact that it is the changes, the impacts are not exclusive in the sense of the climate change theory, that we will get drier, certain countries will become warmer, will become, some part of the continent will become wetter. But what makes it then exclusive, as she tried to explain, is how do we adapt and what technology do we have in adapting? So when we separate the two, I think Africa emits only 1% of greenhouse gases. And yet we are the ones that will really feel the knockoff, and it goes down into what kind of access do each African countries have in terms of healthcare, in terms of irrigation systems in our different countries. So I know definitely South Africa is different to Nigeria, and we are different countries, but we're all in one continent. So definitely, when we speak about the science and the climate change and the impacts, it is a global thing. But when we do speak about the adaptation and the mitigation strategies, they differ. And so it does become important to separate the two in understanding the extreme impacts for each individual country, and understanding the poverty rates, the unemployment rates, and what that actually means once you add in the element of climate change.
Děkuji moc. Alexandre, můžu předat slovo? Slyšíme se? Alexandre?
Okay, I only hear you now.
Jo, děkuji. Tak v podstatě můžu jenom souhlasit s tím, že
I can't but agree that the impact of climate change
hodně specifické regionální.
will be very regionally specific.
Globální v tom smyslu, že opravdu
And on the other hand, they are also global because they will not hit only Africa or Europe or the Pacific Islands. It will hit everyone everywhere.
A to se týká i důsledku a možnosti adaptace.
And obviously it also
na některé nedávné
means something for the strategies of adaptation. We have mentioned the impacts on migration, for example, and the numbers are really terrifying because it's tens or hundreds of millions of people who will be forced to relocate. They will be forced to move either because the oceans are rising, and these effects will combine and enhance each other. And unless we are able to react to these phenomena now, we know they are coming. And this is something that will come even if you reduce emissions. The pressure on people and populations will be higher anyway. Even if you reduce emissions, they will need support on the level of global agreements and national governments. For example, the Paris Agreement looks like something that is very distant from, say, the populations in Africa. But we also need to address it on the global level, and we all need to be a part of the solution. And although, as you said, the inhabitants of Africa are only responsible for less than 1% of global emissions, they are almost not a part of the problem at all, and yet they disproportionately have to bear the consequences so much more than rich people in the West. And it sounds like a cliche, the global north and the global south, but that's the size of it, because the impacts are disproportionate and it will only grow worse. And the global north is disproportionately better off in these terms and better technologically able to adopt. And unfortunately, these disproportions are only deepening. That's not sustainable for the future. I'd like to respond to what you mentioned before. You were saying that science is already telling us what is happening, so we know what we should do. We need to reduce emissions, obviously, and we also know that Africa is not responsible for emissions at all, and yet they have to face the burden. Basically, the global north is responsible for carbon emissions. So my question has several aspects. So what is the problem? If we all know that we are going to bear the impact, so why is the response so low? Why nobody is doing anything? Everybody is talking about climate change, but why the response is so slow in coming? As you said, we need to address these impacts before they hit us. So why nothing is happening? And another question, I don't know if this was during the Paris Agreement negotiations. It was the developing countries who were saying no to some of the restrictions because they said, we did not cause this and we need to develop. So we will produce more emissions. So is this progress? So is it necessary when Africa is only industrializing? Perhaps they could show us a new way. Although many governments in the global south are against this, maybe I will start with Mr. Ach. What is...
These are really essential questions to ask. And there is a gap in natural sciences because natural scientists will give you his or her opinion why we do or don't do this or that, but there are several factors why we are where we are right now. One of them, and we are discussing it at the moment, that we perceive the urgency to deal with climate change, but at the same time, we keep postponing our response. We keep saying, oh, that will come some 20 or 30 years later, 30 years in future. So we try not to think about it because people don't want to deal with unpleasant thoughts. So it's about the way we think, actually. So our willingness to decrease consumption of fossil fuels and carbon emissions is limited. The problem is that the current economy is still based on fossil fuels. Still, we rely on fossil fuels. And of course, Africa can't do the same. The same goes for South Africa or Asia or China. We know we need to do something else. Africa needs to develop in a different way. In Potsdam Institute, actually people talk about climatic crisis in a different way. These discussions are going on. We know that it's not a question of distant future, but we are still moving rather slow. Well, something is happening, that's for sure. We are trying to do something, but we are not fast enough. We need to adapt, we need to mitigate, and we need to be faster. Because we don't have much time, we don't have 10 or 12 more years. We don't have time, actually. We don't have time at all. So we need to adopt certain measures that will be felt in the future. That's true. So still, we don't feel the urgency, and therefore we don't do enough. And also, we will feel the impacts in near future. In the Czech Republic, for sure, we are already facing droughts. For several years, we have been forced to deal with it. We see fires in California. And once people see the real impacts, immediate impacts right now, not sometimes in distant future, when they see it right now, then they are more willing to do something about it. But it's still not enough. So we need to explain to the people what needs to be done. Thank you. And Ndoni, would you like to comment on that?
So I think it goes back to the previous points around communication, in that in Africa, the way that we communicate climate change needs to change itself. So if we're still talking about it in terms of numbers and stats and maths and all of that, obviously the leaders are going to ask themselves, so where do I get involved in this? But if we communicate it and understand, what do our leaders need and what do our leaders need to get solved in our continent in terms of job creation, in terms of correct healthcare and making sure that our population is healthy, then the conversation can change in how we speak about climate change. So if we're talking about the impacts of fossil fuels, it should be directed on healthcare and not just the numbers of this is how much emissions that are going out, but actually speaking from a perspective of, yes, these are the numbers, but you're still impacted, and this is what it means in terms of healthcare, meaning that you need to provide this amount of beds or medication or treatments for your people. And so the conversation of climate change is focused around an international conversation. And once we change that and actually try to target Africa, then we will start to message it differently, you know. And so it's a matter of saying, you know, what are the indigenous knowledge systems? How do we get locals involved? And we never see that in international media. We see climate change is hitting us. These are the impacts. And so communication and who is the target interest, who is the market, plays a role as to then the conflict of why should we actually be not developing as a continent. And yeah, so it just boils down into that. And hopefully once we change that, then it will change the urgency in our leaders to want to change this once the message is directed to them. And to be honest, the message right now just looks like a Western problem and not ours. And that's the problem.
Pardon, já jsem se dal na mute. Tak velmi zajímavé. Děkuji moc. Barbara,
thank you, Tony. This was great. This is really interesting for us. Perhaps, Barbara, do you want to add anything? I think we're running out of time, so...
Tak máme ještě nám zbývá zhruba 8 minut.
I think we have about 8 minutes and we have 2 questions from the audience. So I'll read them out to you. One is specifically for Ndoni, and the other is for all of us. So in the context of what we have been talking about, could you tell us perhaps what concrete steps should follow in fighting climate change in Africa?
Sure, I'll try to answer that as quick as I can. I think the first thing is if you Google climate change, what is the image that you see? Who's the leading conversation person? And understand that whatever that person is leading from, they are coming from their perspective and their background. So we need to change first and foremost the image in which we see climate change. And then once we change the image, you might find that Africans or different African continents can now start to align and feel the importance of it. So international media needs to change as to who they put in the forefront and diversify that image. And then the second thing is we need to understand and tailor-make solutions for climate change for each continent, as Barbara had said, that we need to actually start understanding that this is an individual problem and not a global problem. So when we understand the stats that Africa is emitting 1% versus global, how then do we change the narrative to make sure that Africa still feels the importance of their footprints on the earth? And so we need to tailor-make each solution and not generalize it. And the last point, which I loved, is the importance of social science in climate change, in that climate change we understand the science, but we're just not getting it, you know? I don't know. And that just goes into the importance of communicators, of activists, of integrated learning and research, meaning transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary, linking up a scientist with your social people and linking up with the experts of the country and actually trying to see, you know, how do we look at the problem in a holistic and a multidisciplinary angle.
Děkuji moc, Ndoni. Já se omlouvám.
Thank you very much, Ndoni. And there is a second question, which is also for you. So if I can ask you again.
Kratičkou na 1 minutu. Existuje nějaký plán?
If you can keep it under 1 minute, is there anything like a Green New Deal in Africa? Is there anything like a Green New Deal in Africa?
I think there is. A Green Deal in Africa. I just looked into it right now. There is one that is actually out for South Africa.
Tak já vám moc děkuju. Chtěl by ještě někdo reagovat krátce?
Tak jestli můžu krátko.
If anybody wants to have a short comment.
Za mě si myslím, že ta
I would like to say that
a teď myslím na poli řešení a na poli mitigace.
So far, the response in terms of mitigation, not in the field of adaptation, that's another part of the question, but in terms of mitigation, we really don't see how urgent this is, and I think that's a key of key importance. I don't want it to sound like a cliche, but what Greta Thunberg says, unless we approach it as a crisis, we cannot solve it like a crisis. The pandemic, we approach it as a global crisis. And I think it's the rhetoric, as Ndoni said, we need to change communication. And we need to change communication also to help motivate the urgency of the problem. I think there's a huge gap also among experts where they don't really see it as something that concerns everybody now. And I think that has to change.
Tak já bych asi vzhledem k času děkuju moc.
I think we ran out of time, so I would like to thank all of you in participating on this panel. I'm really in awe of you. And you also scared me because thinking about it, thinking about what's going to happen, I hope that climate change is not going to mean that we are in a COVID way of life all the time. But yeah, we will have to face it as a crisis, because why are we talking about the pandemic as a crisis? We're approaching it that way. And we should treat climate change in that way. And it's not something that's desirable, obviously, but with all the responses coming from you, I guess that's not to be avoided. In fact, that's something to be expected in the near future. Anyway, I'd like to thank all of you for participating. And I'd like to tell the viewers that this is not our last panel discussion on climate change in Africa. There's another one at 8:30 tonight. And I'd like to invite you to this panel discussion, the last one in the cycle, and perhaps next year in Ji.hlava, maybe we'll have a debate on climate change in the context of Central Europe based on what we've heard. Thank you very much. Mm-hmm.